But we're glad to have you here. We're glad to be together. I love my kids. I love raising them, but so often I'm getting to the age where more and more I can remember more of my own childhood, and I remember my parents being my age, but I was the kid. Like, that's a weird experience. I remember when my mom turned 40 was the day that I brought Janine to meet my parents for the first time. That's weird. But there are other just kind of common experiences that I think I see in my kids. Probably the most common that, like, especially if you're a parent, you really get this. The statement, "that's not fair." Like, it's all over the place. It happens all the time. I remember doing that as a kid. I remember my older brother. I was the second out of four, but really, we kind of had two separate families because it was me and my older brother. We were like 2.5 years apart, and then it was 6 years between me and the next brother, and then 12. I don't know if my parents didn't understand how things worked or what was going on, but there was, a pretty good spread there between me and my younger brothers. But anyway, I remember seeing what my older brother got, and I remember so many times thinking, that's not fair. I didn't get what he got. I remember, so this is throwing my brother under the bus a little bit. We grew up in a pretty conservative family, and it was the 90s. And so super conservative, right, in the 90s. And my brother went away on a youth group trip, and I didn't go on youth group trips. I wasn't quite old enough yet. But he came back with his ear pierced. And my parents weren't super excited about that. He was. They weren't. And I remember thinking, I was like, well, I want that too. That's not fair. And my dad's like, you don't want what's coming to him. You don't want this to be fair right now. But now I see it in my kids, and like, that's not fair happens all the time. It happens like when I break a cookie apart because we don't want to give them a full cookie. We just want them to have half a cookie. I got to be so careful to break that cookie exactly in half. Otherwise, that's not fair. Yeah, you get where this is going. Yeah, and what happens next is if it's not fair and I break the cookie in the wrong spot or I give one kid something that the other kid doesn't, what they want is their own kind of version of justice. And if you ask them what that means, they'll say, I want this to happen. I want you to take from them and give it to me. Now that's different. Should I answer it? That would be fun. I don't know who that kid is, but they would get a different experience. Anyway, so, their version of justice is that they want me to, take a little bit of that cookie and give it to the other one. Now, there's two different perspectives there, isn't there? Like, for the one that had more to begin with and now has less because I corrected the action, that's a disappointment, isn't it? Because you took from me what I had. And the other one who maybe started with less but now gets it evened out, they're like, yes, this is justice. Justice has been served. I feel vindicated in this moment. Now, as silly as that kind of sounds with cookies and stuff, one of my observations that I've had is I don't think adults ever grow up. I don't think we do. I think we just hide some things a little bit better. And one of the things I don't think we've really outgrown is that sentiment of, that's not fair. Like, I think we look at that, and oftentimes we think about that in all sorts of situations. That's not fair. Now, maybe as we grow a little bit older, we maybe get a greater capacity to deal with some of those disappointments in life, but at the end of the day, there's this sense of, that's not fair. We can see it in ourselves. I think we can see it in the world around us. Things happening to people in their life, and we think, that's not fair. I want that. What about me? Now, if it was within our power in those moments, I believe that we would effect some version of our own justice in life. I think we would figure out a way to correct those things if we had the power. The problem is that we don't always have. That was my son playing with some jelly stuff. This morning is awesome. I told you. You picked the best day to be with us. All right, wait a second. We're going to try this again. Hey, everybody. All right. I think that if we were being honest with ourselves, if we had the power to correct those things, even if we understood that what we're enacting isn't necessarily justice, we probably would do that. And I'm thankful that we don't always have the power to do that, because we don't oftentimes have what is necessary to go along with power, and that's called perspective. We might see a disadvantage, or we might see a justice issue, but what we don't often have is perspective. I think there's a tension that we feel when we get there. Now, this morning, before we continue on, I want to be very careful. We're talking about justice, but what we're not talking about is some political version of justice or some sociological version of justice, some theory of justice. What we want to talk about and what we want to understand is God's version of justice. So with that, I want to ask you, if you have a Bible with you, to open up to Micah chapter 6. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's all right. You can easily download the Bible app on your phone. A lot of us are accessing it there, or you can just follow along on the screen above me if you'd like to do that as well. We're going to be in Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Now, before we dive into even that, I just want to give you just a little bit of an on-ramp to what we're reading. So Micah is a prophet in the nation of Israel. Now, prophets were people who spoke on behalf of God. God would speak to the individual, and they would speak to other people. This prophet's name is Micah, and he was speaking to God's people, Israel, at a time when they were at a unique point in their history. They were at a unique point in their history because they had a lot of agreements with the Lord, and they weren't doing so well in their relationship with God. They were, to put it bluntly, they were not being very faithful with God. They were supposed to live in good relationship with God, but they had kind of walked away from that. God had what was called a covenant relationship with Israel. And a covenant relationship, we might sometimes think about in terms of a contract, but it's not really a contract. A contract is like a you do this and I'll do this, and that's the agreement. It's more of like a business agreement. But a covenant is a relational agreement. It certainly includes things that we might consider contractual. But the reality is it's so much more than that. In a covenant relationship, we agree to be committed to one another in a specific way, and because of that, it requires certain activities and actions on behalf of both sides. So God has a covenant relationship with Israel. And that covenant relationship means that they are tied together in a special way, and that they are committed to acting in a certain way toward one another. God would be faithful to Israel. He would protect Israel. He would bless his people. And in return, they would, basically, it boils down to they were called to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and they were called to love their neighbor as themselves. Everything that God gave them, all of the rules, all of that was meant to boil down to those two things, to love God and to love others. That was the understanding. That was the relationship. And over time, this relationship had broken down. And we get to Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. We read this: "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Now, I grew up in the church. I've grown up I spent a lot of time around Christians. We love this last verse, all right? If you don't know Jesus, or maybe you've never even been to a church, you might have even seen these words printed on the back of one of our t-shirts. What we found is that it's actually easier just to put the words on a t-shirt than to do them. So, give that a try, see how it goes. But what we don't pay attention to is the overall context, the things that surround this verse. And so we want to kind of slow down and understand not just what's going on in in this passage, but kind of what's going on around this passage. Like we said, Israel was at this time where there was broken down relationship with the Lord. And Micah, his job is to bring God's word to Israel, to the people of Israel, and to try to correct them, to try to bring them back into a right relationship with God. And this has happened time and time again. And time again, the people of God have kind of responded mostly half-heartedly. And so what we see here is we see a moment in time where Micah is speaking for verses 6 and 7, he's speaking kind of with one voice on behalf of Israel. He's capturing their heart and their voice in response to God's corrective words to them. God has corrected them. He's called them out of what they were doing, and now they're responding to God. And their first response is, God, what is it going to take? If we could go back to verse 6, what is it going to take? What shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? So Israel's first response, this kind of unified voice, is in first observation, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek sarcastic response. God has corrected them, and they respond a little bit embittered. Essentially, they're saying, God, what's it going to take? What do you want right now? Like, what are you hoping for? You've corrected us, God, but what is it you really want? Do you want us to offer a sacrifice? The first sacrifice that's written is a lamb, a year-old burnt offering. Now, we don't understand sacrifices all that well. We don't make animal sacrifices. We don't make what's mentioned in just a moment, a sacrifice of oil. But what God did in his covenant relationship with people was he allowed them to use some of the means that many cultures were already using around sacrifice and offering in order to represent his forgiveness against their trespasses. Now, we kind of look at sacrifices and we think that's a weird system. Why did God implement that? But here's the thing that we need to understand. Virtually every culture had a religious practice that involved sacrifice. So God was allowing them to worship the way that they would worship. But he wanted it bent just a little bit differently toward himself. He wanted his people to be unique. While still offering sacrifices, he wanted to make sure that they were just different enough in what they were used to in their acts of worship, that it still reflected his heart for them. So they still offered burnt sacrifices just like the nations around them, but instead of trying to appease a god, instead of trying to manipulate a god or just pay off a god, it was meant to reflect God's restorative heart in relationship with Israel. So as God corrects Israel, they come before him and they say, God, what do you want us to bow down to you with? Do you want us to go back to the sacrificial system? The best of our flock, the young, the pure, the innocent lamb. Do you want us to sacrifice that? Is that going to make you happy? Is that me? Seems like it's me, doesn't it? We've got all sorts of things going on this morning, friends. We've got all sorts of things going on. So Israel has this heart. And then they kind of escalated. When we go on to the next verse, we'll read a little bit more. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? So this voice of Israel is starting to escalate. It's going from the realistic, prescribed sacrifices and offerings that God had given them, and now they're really kind of getting hyperbolic in their language. They're really starting to exaggerate. They're saying, God, what's going to be enough for you? What's going to close this deal? We understand you're upset with us. Is it good enough just to, kind of follow along with the things that we have followed along with? Do you just want a lamb, or do you want 10,000? How about 1,000 rivers of oil? What if we gathered all the oil in the world? God, would that please you then? Will you be happy with it? Will you get off our backs? That's essentially the attitude that's coming from Israel in this passage. They understand what's wrong in the world, but what they essentially try to do is they try to buy off God. Scholars and commentators, Walke, Alexander, and Desmond, say this about Israel as a singular person. He, being Israel, need not change. God must change. He compounds his sin of refusing to repent by suggesting that God, like man, can be bought. His willingness to raise the price does not reflect his generosity, but veils a complaint that God demands too much The reverse side of his bargaining is that he hopes to buy God off as cheaply as possible. We'll leave that up there for just a moment because I think it really does capture Israel's unified complaint against God. God, you ask too much. You see, even if Israel, even if the voice that comes out of this passage were true and that he was capable of delivering 1,000 rivers of oil, I love what the scholars here point out is he thinks that would be a bargain price. Why? Because change of heart is much more costly than giving up possessions. It's always been that way. I remember when I was younger, I may have been the bully between me and my older brother. I can't guarantee that, but a lot of my memories kind of lend themselves toward making me believe that I was the bully in the relationship. But I remember hurting my brother, and the problem with being a bully but also having a guilty conscience is it's a rough place to be. It's a rough place to be a bully and feel guilty about your bullying. So I remember hurting my older brother. I hurt him on the knee somehow, and he started crying, and he got really mad, and he was going to go tell mom and dad. I was like, no, I'll go tell on myself. What will it take you to keep you quiet? And I started trying to buy him off, right? I would rather have bought him off than try to change my attitude and actions toward him so he doesn't get hurt. I'm going to still act the way I want to act toward him. So what price do I have to pay in order for that to happen? That's kind of the attitude here behind Israel. They think it's actually a bargain deal if they could pay everything in the world but not have to change their heart. I think we even see this in our culture around us. We'd love to address injustices by paying for them. Now, that might, in the positive sense, reflect an apologetic heart. It might reflect an I see you and I see the wrong mentality. But I think we've kind of gotten into the understanding that maybe possessions, maybe physical possessions, maybe even finances can fix everything. And it can't. Israel believes maybe it can. Maybe if I can escalate this just enough, we don't have to really change anything about ourselves. Now, that's Israel's response to God's justice. That's Israel's response to God's confrontation of themselves. If we go on to Micah 6:8, we see a response from Micah on behalf of the Lord, and it begins with, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. Now, O mortal is still speaking to a singular voice, but talking about all God's people. When God is addressing his people, he's not talking necessarily to the entire world. He's talking to God's people. So here's just a little bit of a behind the scenes. If you don't know Jesus or you're not sure where you stand with Jesus, a lot of what we're going to be talking about this morning is a rule for Christians, and you're a little bit off the hook, okay? But what I also believe is that if you can capture some of what we're talking about, I believe your life will improve. And we'll talk about how in just a second. So when God is talking to his people, he says, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. He's speaking to his people collectively as a singular person, O mortal. And then he says, he's shown you what is good. Now, we've talked about good in the past. Every time we come across this word, we define it. Biblically, good doesn't have as much to do with right and wrong or moral or immoral as it does with things functioning the way they should, which actually includes morality, right? When we function well, we are moral. We are doing right by others. But good in this sense really has to go back to that concept of covenant relationship. Good in the biblical sense is things working as they were intended to work. And so when Israel is now being addressed again, the follow-up is, God has already shown you, Israel, God has already shown you, O mortal, how things should work in this relationship. He's already shown you how this relationship is intended to be lived out. And then it gets summarized again. It's summarized in three ways that God gives his people. That is to flesh out. It's meant to kind of break down this understanding of how to live good in relationship with God. And the first one is Micah speaks to the people and he says, you need to act You need to do justice. You need to act justly. Do justice. Now, when I think of that word justice, again, my mind goes to all sorts of different places. Well, what does justice mean? I mean, we could get really philosophical and really heady really fast around this. But I think what God is actually pointing to is something in himself. If we really want to understand this whole concept of justice, if we really understand that God's people are meant to act justly or to do justice, we have to understand that through the lens of what God is saying. In my mind, when I hear justice, I think justice has been served, meaning somebody's been punished for wrongdoing. Now, if you're at all like me, and that's the first place your mind goes for justice, you, like me, miss the entire heart of God. God is not a punishment God. God has never been a punishment God. In fact, going back to the sacrificial system, one of the things that I love about Israel's unique sacrificial system that God gives them, again, to honor what they were already doing, but to put some parameters around it, is he put some limits on what they can and can't sacrifice. Part of what Israel got really up in arms around was about offering the firstborn. Well, offering human sacrifices, while acceptable in some of the ancient Near East, was not acceptable in Israel. It was something that God would punish. But there's a beautiful aspect to the sacrificial system as well. There was a whole host of Israelites who couldn't afford the pure and spotless lamb, and so God made provision so that no matter how poor they were, there was still a way to worship God like your brothers and sisters were worshiping God. He made provision so that even the poorest of the poor could participate in the sacrificial system. You see, God's not a God of punishment. He's not a God who's looking for the wrongdoing in the world and trying to stifle it. God's justice isn't like my justice. God's justice is more about restoration. You see, there's a difference between punishment and restoration. Punishment is punitive measures without relationship. It's correcting you without any love. But God's restorative, his restoration justice, comes to you because he is driven by love. God's justice is characterized by love. Bruce Waltke has a wonderful quote about justice, capturing kind of two sides, two ways of thinking about justice. He says, "The righteous are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves." You see, I think oftentimes we think about justice in terms of disadvantaging somebody else who has already disadvantaged somebody else. We think what goes around comes around. That's our idea of justice. But God's version of justice is that he is willing to be inconvenienced on our behalf. You see, if we're going to capture the justice heart of God, we have to understand something about God. He doesn't need me. He doesn't need to put up with anything that I've done or anything that I'm wrong in. He doesn't need to put up with anything that I have to offer, but he does. In a very real sense, we could assume that God is very disadvantaged by my way of living. Well, that's without the understanding of God's love. You see, God is more than willing to be disadvantaged on our behalf, on his community's behalf, because he is filled with love for us. It's love that drives his restorative heart. Without that restorative heart, without that love, it's just punishment, but God isn't here to punish. And just like God is a God of justice, he calls his people to be people of justice. He wants us to act justly with one another. If we could go back to Micah 6:8. We read to act justly, and the second thing is to love mercy. Now, mercy is interesting because the word here in Hebrew, if you didn't know, the Old Testament wasn't written, this part of the Bible wasn't written in English. And so we have a little bit of translation to do. And Hebrew words had several meanings oftentimes. At the very least, one, but sometimes it was a word picture that we do our best to translate into English. Here, the translators have translated a particular Hebrew word into mercy. And while the word includes merciful actions, the word is actually much more in line with the word faithfulness or loyalty. Now, before this, the positive examples of that same word in Scripture are used in relationship, in description of God's unyielding loyalty to his people. That's what this word is. It's about God's faithfulness. Just like justice is meant to be painted by God's character, this word faithfulness, this word mercy or merciful is meant to be painted in light of God's faithfulness to us. Just as he has never failed in his relationship with humanity, he has always done what he said he would do. He calls us into that too. Now, I think while we could look at all three of these things separately, I think each one is going to build on the previous. So when we start with this loving, restorative heart of justice for God, that he calls us into a same bit of character that is represented by his loyalty, his covenant faithfulness. And that's meant to further paint the picture of his own justice as well. His justice isn't just driven by love, it's not just driven by compassion, it's driven by an undying, an unyielding loyalty to the people that he's put in this world. God's desire isn't just that things are restored, but that things continue on in a relational sense that is pure and self-giving and loyal toward one another. Again, God points back to all of this being summed up by love God and love others. When we do that consistently, we will never do that perfectly, but when we do that consistently, that's called faithfulness. Here, Scripture calls it mercy. We're being merciful toward one another. Now, I think even in that little bit of a nuance of justice without mercy is like justice without love. There's times when I get really tired of parenting, and if I don't catch myself, what I do is I just start correcting things so that I can, to the shortest, most simple, blunt way that I can, so that I can continue on doing what I want to do. I don't want to be disadvantaged or inconvenienced by what's going on around me. I just want it to stop. You know what I love about God? That's never, ever an aspect of who he is. He is always merciful. He is always loyal. He is always faithful to his people. And he asks his people, in turn, don't just be restorative. Have an ongoing restorative attitude toward him and others that is just characterized by this ongoing faithfulness. And the final thing we see in the passage is Micah saying, also, walk humbly. Walk humbly with your God. Again, we see all these things in the person of God. But we see it clearest, I think, in the person of Jesus. If you fast forward in Scripture, Israel fails again and again and again. They continue to not act justly. They continue to not act mercifully. They continue to not act humbly. And so God comes down in the person of Jesus, which is in and of itself a humbling act. Humbling is lowering yourself beyond what you think it is. The opposite of humility is pride. It's thinking about yourself above and beyond everybody else. It's saying, what about me at the cost of others? You see, again, without humility, there can be no true justice. And we see this clearest in the person of Jesus, who humbled himself even to a death sentence on a cross. For our sake. Talk about disadvantaging yourself for those you love. If you catch anything out of this morning, I want you to understand God's justice is completely self-sacrificial, self-giving, and imbued with a full sense of his love for us. And now he calls his people continually into it. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. You see, humility puts to death, what about me? Humility puts to death, isn't it my right? Humility allows us to look at one another and say, I am willing, like God, to be disadvantaged for your sake. But I'll tell you what gets in my way time and time again is a universal truth. I believe this is a universal truth, and it's this. We all want justice. We all want justice. Every single one of us wants justice. But we often want it our way. It's been well said by many, many people that I want justice toward you, but mercy for myself. The problem isn't that we don't want justice. We all want justice, but what we think justice looks like is often void of humility and mercy and love. Oftentimes what we think about in terms of justice is I want you to be punished so that I can have my way. Oftentimes what we think about justice is exactly the opposite of what we see in God. I do believe we all want justice. I just don't think we have the right perspective to get there. We're willing to wield the power, but we don't have the perspective to do it well and lovingly and humbly and mercifully. Now, I think we all can take steps toward that. I think it's not a sentence on who we are. I think it's not a judgment on who we are, but I think there's ways we can grow into loving and desiring justice and seeing it happen more and more in our lives. Now, if you are a follower of Jesus, this is a non-negotiable for us. We are called to do better in living out justice and mercy and humility. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you're off the hook this morning. But again, here's what I would tell you, is that if you were to live out the things that we're going to say in just a second, I think your life is going to drastically improve in how you feel about yourself. So if you're up for that, I'd encourage you to step into it this morning. The first one is simply this. If we want a heart for justice, our first step is to ask for it. Our first step is to simply ask for it. It's pretty straightforward. If you don't have the resources or the perspective to do something right, you have to gain those resources, don't you? We would look at the rest of life that way. If I don't have what I need to accomplish a task, I either can't do the task or I have to get the resources. In this case, we oftentimes don't have the right type of power and we don't have the right perspective in order to truly live out God's justice in the world. And the very first thing we need to do is we need to get that. And how we get that is we ask God for it. Now, if you're not used to praying, or I think there's a lot of us even in the room this morning who would say, I don't know how to pray very well. I just want to encourage you to keep it simple. Keep it straightforward. Prayer is, in essence, it's thinking towards or speaking to God. And what I would offer you this morning is if you want to grow in a true heart for justice, if you want to grow in living out justice, it starts in your inside. It starts in your own heart. It starts in who you are becoming. And because we don't have the resources we need to ask for them. And so we can think or speak a simple prayer like, God, would you fill my heart with your understanding of justice? Another one that I love to pray is, God, would you help me see others the way you see them? However you want to say it, you can simply say that to the Lord and maybe spend a few moments saying it to the Lord. Maybe you need to repeat it again to convince yourself that this is something that's really, really good for you actually as well. Sit with it. Let it become just kind of a mantra that you pray before the Lord for a little while. And I think if you do, you're going to start to gain His perspective. You see, one thing that we haven't said about justice and perspective and power and righting wrongs is that if we don't have the proper perspective, our justice is at best retribution. It's revenge. But with God's perspective and learning to rely on God's power simply by asking for that to enter into our hearts, we're going to start to see reality in an entirely different way. I think if you actually do this more, if you start to ask for this more regularly, maybe even a few moments every single day, you're going to grow in how you feel about others in the world. I think you're going to be able to walk down the road and you're going to be able to feel freer. I think you're going to be able to be in the marketplace and you're going to feel freer. You're going to be able to go to work and you're going to feel freer. So the first thing you need to do is ask for it. And even if you don't believe in Jesus, this is something you can do, and I think he'll meet you in it. The next step, after we've kind of asked for it in our heart and allowed it to take place, is a one that's really, really difficult, and it's this: forgive quickly. Forgive quickly. I want to tell you a story about why this is so important. A couple of guys I met in a town we used to live in, they had a really, really hard childhood. The sad part is they grew up in a Christian home. They grew up in a home where their parents loved Jesus a lot, at least they said they did, and they traveled all around doing really incredible things for people. And they would tell their kids all the time that God wanted this from them or God wanted that from them, and over time it really tainted their view of who God was. So much so that both of these guys that are about my age, they walked away not just from the church, but from God completely. They wanted nothing to do with God. Now, when I was intersecting their story, they were opening up a little bit and just sharing some of their life with me, and their mom had cancer. And through the process, their dad was true, the same as he always had been, emotionally abusive and spiritually manipulative. And he was that way to his wife as well, and she died of cancer. About 2 years later, after the passing of their mom, their dad had cancer, but he had a completely different tone when it came to his cancer. And I remember talking with both of these guys about their view of God, and they wanted to talk about it. I wasn't forcing them into anything, but I remember one of them said something that stuck out to me. He said this: "If God heals my dad, I hate God." Because his dad was asking for healing. He was trusting in healing from God. And he said, if God heals my dad, I hate God. I will never trust him. What he couldn't do was forgive his dad. I'm not saying his dad deserved it. You see, retribution and revenge says, I give you what I think you deserve. But God's justice is restorative. It gives us oftentimes what we don't deserve. Oh, we like that. There's not a whole lot of arguing. We like that. That's mercy toward us, but what we want is justice toward others in our understanding of justice. We want God to be merciful and to forgive me and give me what I think I need, but when it comes to somebody else, I want him to punish them. He could not forgive. And the problem is, it didn't change anything in his dad's life, and it didn't change anything in his mom's life. What it did was kept him captive to the idea that he wanted something to happen but didn't have the perspective or power to enact. He wasn't punishing his parents, he was becoming a prisoner in his own heart. You see, that's what unforgiveness does for us. It doesn't actually carry out justice in what we think it should do or what should happen. It actually enslaves us in a way that nobody can see, but we feel deeply. And so if we want to be a people who are growing in our heart for justice, we start with asking for it, but the next step has to be, we have to be really, really good and quick at forgiving others. We have to be really fast at it. And the hard part is that forgiveness, oftentimes when we're called to it, and Jesus does call every one of his followers to it, if you're a follower of Jesus, you actually don't get a choice. But that's just it. Forgiveness is a choice. You have to choose forgiveness. You won't always want it, and sometimes you'll hate it. But I think it's helpful to understand that when you forgive somebody, you don't call what they did good or right. You just recognize in humility before God that you don't have the perspective or the power to treat that injustice the right way. Forgiveness isn't saying what you did is okay and you're not accountable for it. Forgiveness is saying, I can't keep you accountable to that, so I trust God to do it. That's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness doesn't let anybody off the hook, it puts them on God's hook. And what that does in return is it frees you up in your own heart. Because when you know something needs to happen, but you don't have the power to do it, That's horrible. And it leads to a bitter life. So you don't have to forgive. The alternative is you can die bitter. You could do that. That's your choice. The other part of forgiving quickly is, I think, overlooking many offenses. I think that it's increasingly easy. It's easy to look at our culture around us and say, hey, everybody is so much more easily offended these days. Yet even saying that is kind of tipping our hand that we've been offended by somebody else. I love this proverb. Proverbs 19:11 says, a person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. I think we've gotten really good at every single thing that offends us talking about it to somebody else. But Proverbs actually says it's really, really wise actually not to talk about everything that's offended, but just to let it go, just to roll right off your back. You could be the wisest person in the room and nobody would know it because you choose not to be offended by other people and you've learned to forgive quickly. Guess who the freest person in the room is at that point? You. The least free person isn't the person that gets their way. It's the person that lives in bitterness and a constant vigilance to correct others. Having a heart for justice starts with receiving God's perspective and power and quickly forgiving others, even in big things. Guess what? You don't even always have to point it out. I remember a coach asking me one time, and this is not like an athletic coach, I had those, but this was kind of like a spiritual life coach in my life, and I was really struggling to forgive somebody, and I remember him sitting me down, and he said, listen, if you got everything you wanted out of this person, and that person came and truly from the depths of their heart said, I'm so sorry for what I did to you, what would that change in your life? Nothing. It actually wouldn't change anything. I still have to forgive, and I still have to choose to forgive, even though what they apologized, and technically that should fix it, right? But it never fixes things. The only thing that really fixes things is forgiveness. Choosing to release somebody else. So let's get good about that. If we want to be people who are growing in our heart of justice, we ask for it, and then we learn to forgive really, really quickly. Just make it a choice now. Whenever something comes up, forgive it. And then finally, we do want to right the wrongs. Now, I'm not talking about right other people's wrongs. I'm talking about righting our own wrongs. Conflict is easy when we get to point things out to other people about what they've done wrong to us. It's so much harder when we look at every single thing in life from the perspective of what is mine to own. Those are the things I have to right. Again, we want justice in the sense of punishment toward others, but we want mercy for ourselves. What if we got really, really good at owning our own things? Owning what we can, not concerned about correcting somebody else, but correcting ourselves. Well, that's a lot harder. It would probably be a lot easier just to try to gather up 1,000 rivers of oil and give them to the offended. Wait, that's Israel, right? We have to own our own stuff. We have to correct what we have made wrong. It's like if I've done something or I said something to my wife that I would do, you could probably take your pick of circumstances, something that I said I would do and either knowingly or unknowingly didn't follow through on it. I have a choice. I can apologize to her and then just carry on, or I could apologize, and if there's still opportunity, I could do what I said I would do but didn't. You see, one is righting the wrong, the other is just words. It's just words. I promise, if you start asking regularly for God's perspective, to see things and people the way He sees them, if you can learn to forgive quickly, start with just really small things. If somebody offends you, just in the moment, choose, say, I forgive it. I'm going to let it go. And then we start owning what we can when things are wrong in the world and owning the things that we have power and control over for ourselves. I think we are going to be incredibly free. You see, what I don't want is I'm not looking, because it's not even possible, I'm not looking for people to look at this church and say, man, they are perfect people. What I would love is if people looks at this, if they could look at this church and say, you know what, they mess up a lot, but they own it every single time, and I truly believe they want to make things right. You see, nobody's perfect. God doesn't assume Israel's perfect, but He also knows just throwing things at a problem doesn't fix it. Only true heart change, which is harder, is the only thing that will fix it. If we want to grow in justice, it starts in here. It starts in each of us. That's the challenge. Let's pray.